Hi guys, and welcome back to Too Cool for Middle School. It is almost Martin Luther King Jr. Day and almost Black History Month, and a lot of us will begin to teach lessons about people like Rosa Parks, and we'll talk about the Civil Rights Movement. And today I just wanted to offer you some resources to look at before you get into that section in your curriculum. This is a little bit weird for me to talk about because for the first 4 or 5 years that I was a teacher, I taught 8th grade US history, and that time period doesn't cover the Civil Rights Movement, so I didn't teach that. But I also never did anything special for Black History Month or even for Martin Luther King Jr. Day because multicultural history is so embedded in every single thing that I do as a history teacher that it actually never occurred to me to make a separate thing out of Black History Month or MLK Jr. Day or anything like that. But now that I'm in the English department and I do teach English, there are more decisions to make, and so I've found that I can incorporate certain topics during certain months and certain times of the year, and it can be helpful. Like for example, last year, I'm not really great about remembering to incorporate poems, so during National Poetry Month we did poems, and that was just a way to keep me accountable. So I think it's good to teach lessons during Black History Month, although it seems a little bit weird to me because I just feel like that should be incorporated into all of your curriculum. But nevertheless, I know that most people who become teachers learn mostly about teaching, and you don't necessarily have time to go into every nuance of all of the curriculum that you teach. But most of my education personally is in the area of history, so that is something that I know pretty well. I studied the Civil Rights Movement quite a bit, and then even outside of my classes, I was really interested in the women who were a part of the Civil Rights Movement and who really carried it on their backs and did a lot more than they ever get credit for. So when I first came across a story about Rosa Parks in an English textbook, it was like a little, reader thing, like all my students would read it and underline the vocabulary words, and the short articles in there were just kind of a vehicle for vocabulary and grammar lessons and stuff. But there was this story about Rosa Parks, and we read through the whole thing, and I was like, you guys, there are so many problems with the way that this story was written. And it wasn't like inaccurate per se, but it certainly didn't give the full story of who Rosa Parks was and the work that she did and what the community around her did. So even though like this wasn't a history lesson, it was more of a vocabulary lesson than anything else, I was like, okay, let's back this up and let me like reframe this story for you before we move on. And that curriculum that I was teaching was published pretty recently, so I would imagine that what most people are working with around the country is probably pretty flawed. So before you pull out whatever lesson your district gave you on Rosa Parks, I just want to give you a little bit of background information that might help you frame it a little bit better for your students. I was flipping through some of the books that I saved from like my credential program and my master's program the other day, and I found this book which I love. This is called Putting the Movement Back into Civil Rights Teaching, and the foreword is by John Lewis. This is an edited book full of articles and essays and lesson plans about teaching civil rights and incorporating it into your lessons in your curriculum, and this book is just a fabulous resource. I was looking at the publishing date. It was published in 2004, which is the year I graduated high school, so this is a little bit old, and since it's edited, a lot of these articles and essays were written like in the 90s. So I was actually a little bit surprised to see that people have been talking about this for a long time, and I really haven't seen like the complaints addressed here fixed yet, and we're in 2018. So one of the articles that as I was flipping through, I read, I don't remember if I read this when I actually was using this textbook for whatever class it was. I don't remember that either. But as I was reading over this, I was like, oh, this is really good. This article is towards the beginning. It's called The Politics of Children's Literature, What's Wrong with the Rosa Parks Myth, by Herbert Cole. And I'm going to use his essay as an outline. There are only a few things that I could even add to this. He pretty much covered everything. Herbert Cole is, where did it say? He established the Center for Teaching Excellence and Social Justice at the University of San Francisco School of Education, and writes a regular column for Rethinking Schools, which is a great publication. If you are trying to make your teaching more culturally responsive, that's a great place to start. Now, before we get into his essay, I just want to say that I'm coming to you in love. And I know that as a white educator, sometimes it can be difficult to teach things like the civil rights movement with authority. Because to be honest, we really don't have it. We need to be doing a lot of research and a lot of reading and a lot of listening in order to gain any kind of authority to be teaching this material. A useful framework that I recently kind of adopted is from the book called White Awake by Daniel Hill. And that book is really good if you are white and you want to be an ally for people of color, but you have to recognize that you're probably doing things wrong at some point and you're probably wrong about certain things, but the framework that he provides is moving from blindness to sight. So it's not about being a horrible person, or not, it's not about being racist, but it's about just not having eyes to see what other people see and what they experience on a daily basis. And the only way to move from blindness to sight and kind of open your eyes to what's going on around you is through listening and through education and through reading and through learning. So we're all somewhere on this journey. And if you feel defensive at any point and feel like your lessons are just fine and you don't want anyone telling you that you need to do it differently, I just ask you to hold on to that, set it aside for a second, and continue to listen, because in all areas of our teaching we can always learn more. We can always rethink the way that we do things and strive to make it better for our students. So that being said, let's move on to the problematic way that we tend to teach Rosa Parks and her story, and that she was this old woman who was a seamstress, and she sat down on the bus one day and they asked her to move for a white person, and she was just tired of standing up and moving when a white person wanted to sit down, so she refused, and her act of civil disobedience sparked a civil rights movement and a bus boycott that made life better for Black people everywhere. That's how we tend to teach it, but the real story is just so much more exciting. It's so much more empowering for our students. And I feel like it's not as clunky. Like the watered down story that we tell is a little bit clunky, and students have questions and they're not quite sure how to make the connection between like not standing up on a bus to like civil rights for everybody, and that's because it's not the full story. So Herbert Cole talks about 7 issues with this method. Some of them I'll spend a little bit more time on, some of them I'll let you research a little bit more on your own. But the first problem he has is with portraying Rosa Parks as Rosa the tired. It had been a long day at work and she just simply didn't feel like standing up. The reason this is problematic is because her work as a seamstress was really secondary to her work as a community organizer. She was one of the first women to join the NAACP, and she was their secretary for a long time. She was already well known in community activist circles, and according to Cole, she was well known to all of the African American leaders in Montgomery for her opposition to segregation, her leadership abilities, and her moral strength. Since the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision, she had been working to desegregate the Montgomery schools. She had also attended an interracial meeting at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee a few months before the boycott. And it continues on. But the point is that she had been active in like civil disobedience and civil rights work for a long time. She didn't suddenly become this like beacon of the movement just because she was tired one day. From other sources that I've read, this was planned. It wasn't a spur of the moment decision to just stay seated one day. There had been other attempts at bus boycotts and people refusing to stand. This wasn't the first time this had ever happened. There was already work being done in this area before this famous day that we all learn about. The second issue that Herbert Cole takes with the way that we sometimes teach this is that we ignore the reality of racism. And so he says, locating segregation in the past is a way of avoiding dealing with its current manifestations and implying that racism is no longer a major problem. If we only talk about racism and segregation as if, you know, that is only something that ever happened in the South and it's only something that happened a long time ago, that's not only inaccurate, but I feel like it makes it more difficult for our students to connect to the content. And if you teach middle school or high school, I think students will call your bluff on that too. This piece was written in 1989, and since then, I mean, in the recent months, we've seen displays of racism that deserve to be talked about in school. I don't teach elementary, so I know that it's more difficult to talk about those issues with younger, less mature students, but there are articles and lesson ideas in this book that can also give you help in that area. So I'm going to move on from that point, but just be aware of that. And then he also goes into just explaining accurately how the segregated sections of the bus worked, and that black people were never permitted to sit in the front, but sometimes they were in the middle, and then if a white person wanted to sit in the middle, then the black person would have to move to the back. He just wants to be sure that we're clear on that. His next section is on dignity and history, and this again is just arguing against referring to her as tired. Like, maybe never say that word at all in this lesson. It wasn't about being tired. It was about resisting. And also in other sources that I have read, they talk about the purposeful intention of using Rosa Parks as the person to resist. I wish that I could remember what book I read this in. I think it's one that I have in my classroom. And as a historian, I feel very guilty about like making this claim and not backing it up with evidence, but maybe some of you in the comments have read about this as well. But even without that, I remember the first time that, you know, I encountered this story in our little reader, and then I asked some of my students, I said, what would have been the difference if she had not been an older, small woman? What if she had been the opposite? What if she had been a large, young man? And immediately they knew that if a young, strong man had tried to refuse to move on the bus, the police would have dragged him out, they would have been violent with him, and they could have portrayed him as defiant and hostile, and my students came up with all of this. These were sixth graders at the time, and they were the ones who started to recognize the optics. But if you use a smaller, older, gentle looking woman like Rosa Parks, it looks worse when the police drag her off, and when she is arrested. She's in her work clothes, she's dressed nicely. That's another thing that he doesn't go into, I don't think, in this article, but just from outside reading that I've done. People knew that they were going to be arrested. Things were planned. So my argument is that Rosa Parks was chosen for this mission, and it was planned that she was going to be arrested. And people would dress very nicely knowing that they were going to be arrested, so that when they were on TV, when pictures were taken, they didn't look rough, they didn't look poor, they looked put together. They would wear their church clothes, their Sunday best, because optics matter. And that's another thing we're going to get into in a minute, that kind of steals from this story. It wasn't spur of the moment, it was planned out. There was strategy behind this, and people in the NAACP and SNCC and all of these other organizations understood that optics matter, pictures matter, the narrative matters, the way that this ends up on the news matters, and it wasn't just one day I got too tired to stand up. This was a thoughtful civil act of disobedience. So that gets into his next section here called Civil Disobedience, Not Mere Stubbornness. I think this year I'm probably going to print this out for my students. Rosa Parks said in an interview later, "I had problems with bus drivers over the years because I didn't see fit to pay my money in the front and then go to the back. Sometimes bus drivers wouldn't permit me to get on the bus, and I had been evicted from the bus. But as I say, there had been incidents over the years. One of the things that made this incident get so much publicity was the fact that the police were called in and I was placed under arrest. See, if I had just been evicted from the bus and he hadn't placed me under arrest or had any charges brought against me, it probably could have been just another incident. So again, she had been doing this for a while, but the opportunity for policemen to come and for this to gain attention nationally is what really moved it forward. This is the part that really drives this home. He also talks about planned resistance. He says, community support for the boycott is portrayed as being instantaneous and miraculously effective the very day after Parks was arrested. Things don't happen that way, and it is an insult to the intelligence and courage of the African American community in Montgomery to turn their planned resistance to segregation into a spontaneous emotional response. I'm going to continue because this part is good. The actual situation was more interesting and complex. Not only had Rosa Parks defied the bus segregation laws in the past, according to E.D. Nixon, but in the 3 months preceding Parks' arrest, at least 3 other African Americans had been arrested in Montgomery for refusing to give up their bus seats to European Americans. In each case, Nixon and other people in leadership positions in the African American community in Montgomery investigated the background of the person arrested. They were looking for someone who had the respect of the community and the strength to deal with the racist police force, as well as all of the publicity that would result from being the center of a court challenge. She was the perfect candidate for this work, but many people were involved in this work. She had hundreds of other people behind her who were already working towards a bus boycott. Cole also adds, the boycott lasted 381 inconvenient days, something not usually mentioned in children's books. So I remember with my class talking about that as well. If you're not taking the bus, how are you getting where you need to go? How are you getting to work? And then talking about, did the bus company suddenly have a change of heart and decide that all people are really equal and they should be allowed to sit wherever they want? Or was this hurting their bottom line and they needed their Black customers back on the bus? I think it's important to understand that money is a very powerful way to change things. This is the beginning of 2018 as I make this video, and there have been a lot of acts of protest in the past year or two, some of them more effective than others, and you have to understand that money is what makes people change their mind. And talking about effective methods of civil disobedience in your history classes or in your English classes can be really eye-opening for students and really empowering for them as well. And sometimes when you watch TV and you look at protests of other kinds, at least for me, I see like, they needed a better education in how to protest, because there are effective ways to do it and ineffective. There are violent ways and non-violent ways. There are good ways and bad ways. So Rosa Parks' story really has so many lessons to teach us, but most of them are stripped from the curriculum. The last thing that Herbert Cole brings up is King's role. We tend to jump straight to Martin Luther King right after this, but as he reminds us, the boycott was planned by the WPC, E.D. Nixon, and others in Montgomery. Martin Luther King Jr. was a new member of the community. He had just taken over the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and when Nixon told him that Parks' arrest was just what everybody was waiting for to kick off a bus boycott and assault the institution of segregation, King was at first reluctant. So while Martin Luther King Jr. was definitely instrumental in the civil rights movement, this wasn't necessarily the place where it's accurate to give him credit. The point here is that it was people who don't really have fame that affected change. It was all of these people that you've never heard of that inconvenienced themselves for 381 days and didn't take the bus that affected change. It wasn't necessarily, the person who was the greatest speaker and the greatest leader like Martin Luther King Jr. It was the everyday average people. And again, it wasn't spontaneous. They had been planning this for a long time. They were kind of waiting for that catalyst that was Rosa Parks, but it took a huge group of people that never got famous. And I think that that's actually a much more empowering message for students. That you don't have to be this amazing speaker. You don't have to be somebody who is, nationally famous in order to affect change in your community. But you do need to be a part of those groups. You do need to be talking about it. You do need to be strategizing, and then you can affect real change. So I think that kind of turning this story around a little bit is a much more effective way to teach it. And the curriculum that you are given or the stories that are in the books that are already in your classroom might not be all that effective. So I would just ask you, before you teach this unit on civil rights or on Rosa Parks, read over it and see if you can still use it but just add to it, or if you can even just get your students talking about it and maybe they'll be able to see some of the holes in it. So again, this book, Putting the Movement Back into Civil Rights Teaching, is incredibly helpful. I also used a unit last year on Teachers Pay Teachers about the civil rights movement by Hubbard's Cupboard, and I thought that was actually very well done. It goes into, more aspects of the civil rights movement, but I thought it was really well done. I know that I did a video on it last year. I can't even remember what it was called, but I'll link it down below. But I remember my main takeaway from that was that Martin Luther King Jr. learned to fight strength with weakness and to fight hate with meekness and love. Not only because that's like the moral thing to do, but because visually and on TV, that's effective, and it's a really effective way to get your message across. And when you need to get people on your side and you need people to understand that violence is evil, you can't be violent back. So anyway, I'll link all of that below. But I hope that this is useful to you. I understand that by putting this out on the internet, I'm opening myself up to criticism. I'm not saying that I'm the ultimate authority on the civil rights movement or Rosa Parks, but in continuing to learn about her, I just want to share with you what I know. And that is always the heart of my channel. So good luck. Let me know in the comments below how your lessons go. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.